I'm Alan Cohen. I want to welcome back to our microphones Dr. Stephen Cohen. Dr. Steve Cohen is has been professor of Russian Studies and History emeritus at NYU, has also taught at Princeton, a distinguished scholar of Russian history, among the most distinguished in the U.S. and internationally recognized for his academic work in Russia and on Russia and Soviet political history. Dr. Cohen, thanks for coming back on the program. You have a contrarian view of what's happened with the Malaysian airliner. Would that be fair to state?
No, I don't have a contrarian view because unless something's happened in the last half hour, we just don't know. I don't like these political games that are being played on the dead souls of 300 people. Mm-hmm. When we have conflicting evidence about who shot it down and how it was shot it down. What I have a contrarian view about is this crisis in Ukraine, which has brought the United States and Russia into a very profound new Cold War and could bring us into war with Russia. There's where my real contrarian view, I guess, is located, Alan.
Well, I guess it's hard to separate the two because I think people conflate what happened with the plane with the Ukraine crisis, and a lot of blame, certainly from both the press and pundits, going to Vladimir Putin. So let's talk about who had the motivation to do this, or was this just an accident?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't like speculation because I'm a fact man. I think we get the facts. You and I, for example, Alan, we see something, we agree on the facts, and then we disagree about the interpretation. That's just fine. But when you have a crime or a mystery, and you don't have a smoking gun, and the evidence isn't clear, every police detective then asks who had a motive.
Yeah.
And Russia had no motive. This has been terrible for Putin and for Russia. The rebels who are fighting in eastern Ukraine against Kiev, against the Ukrainian government, had no motive. Why would they want to shoot down a passenger plane? The only person or entity that might have a motive is someone who wanted to make things worse, wanted to turn world opinion against somebody, maybe even bring about a war. But I think in the end, it was an accident. And if it wasn't an accident, if it was not an accident, if someone did this intentionally, the only entity that could have had a motive would have been in Kiev, not in Moscow.
And who in Kiev?
You know, you're tugging me where I don't want to go. I mean, if you want to write a detective story, is it unimaginable that somebody got worried that the United States and the West might weary of this clownish, lethal, hateful, war crime committing government in Kiev and back away from it? That someone may think things have gone too far in this Putin bashing and that we're headed for war with Russia, and that's not good. France and Germany had already told Kiev to stop its attacks on eastern Ukrainian cities. The White House was silent. Kiev wasn't doing very well militarily against the rebels. Maybe somebody needed a game changer. I personally don't believe anybody's capable of doing something like that on purpose. I think it was an accident, and here's what we've got. We've got a little bit of evidence that suggests it was done by the rebels by accident, and a little bit of evidence that it was done by a Ukrainian army unit by accident. And the United States seems to have satellite information that it will not release. And why it won't release it, I don't know.
But who had access then to the mechanism to do it? Who had access to the missile launcher?
This, Alan, I mean, you and I are grown men. This is a complete mythology that's been spun out of Washington and Kiev. The instrument that did it is a surface-to-air missile, not the kind that you and I remember those guys sitting on camels and firing in Afghanistan at low-flying helicopter. That the rebels in eastern Ukraine have. This is a more sophisticated weapon, usually called a Buk, B-U-K, or sometimes it's called an SS, and it has a different number after it, depending on how old it is. Those weapons were those weapons were first manufactured in the 1970s. The press and the State Department are going on like this was some secret classified weapon that was made last year, and only Russia could have had it. No, they were made in the 1970s, jointly in Ukraine and Russia, because the Soviet defense industry was a Russian-Ukrainian complex, and they've continued to be manufactured, and lots of people have them. Russia has them, Ukraine has them, countries in other areas have them because they were sold.
So the notion that it's got to be the rebels because they were able to get their hands on this
that's complete not. There is, let me put it to you like this. If you asked who 100% has that weapon, 100%, the Russian government has it, the Ukrainian government has it. There is no evidence that the rebels had it because they were not a military unit. Now, could they have gotten it? Yes, they could have gotten it in lots of ways. Russia could have given it to them. That's what Obama and Kerry are saying, though they don't know. They could have bought it on the black market. They could have captured it from a Ukrainian military unit.
Now, the president went after Russia for blocking access to the crash site. Did he have a point?
No, they didn't. This is Alan. Have you been on vacation?
Actually, I was.
Oh, well, you've missed it. I mean, you can't.
Actually, I was. I came back Tuesday. But the president. Go ahead.
You can't. They started that nonsense. Not only that, but Russia had told the rebels in Ukraine, don't let the investigators there, don't bury the bodies, loot the bodies. It was a horrible story being told in Washington and Kiev, and it turned out to be untrue. When the Dutch, who lost more people on the aircraft than anyone else, about 2/3 of the passengers were from the Netherlands, collected the bodies, which had been collected by rebels and put in refrigerator cars from a field where they were decomposing because it was 80 degrees. He thanked the rebels. He shook their hand, and he said, on behalf of the Netherlands, you did the best you possibly could. Thank you. This is warmongering by the White House and the State Department. There's no evidence that anybody did anything wrong after the crash.
So how do you think this ends up?
If you really want to know my honest view,
Of course.
I don't know. All right. I think if we had a real president of the United States who was paying attention and was any kind of a statesman, he would force this government in Kiev, which is our government, to declare a ceasefire, and negotiations would begin with Russia and Ukraine and Germany and France and everybody. You could go too, Alan. I mean, the more the merrier, but it's absolutely clear what a peace settlement would look like, and Ukraine would be better off for it. If that doesn't happen, and we keep pushing, and pushing, we are headed toward war with Russia.
So you think the president clearly is not on top of this? You don't think he has a sense of what's going on? I mean,
that is the hardest question of all, because in all my years of watching crises between the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union, we always knew with whom the president consulted on such matters. It might be somebody in the White House, it might be somebody who's retired, it might be a senior statesman. Nobody knows with whom this president speaks. And the handful of people who are assigned to talk to him about Russia don't know what they're talking about.
So there are no Russian scholars like yourself. There are no people in the know, as far as you know, and you're connected to this world that the president confers with.
I'm not at liberty to tell you who he does not confer with, because if I named a couple names of people you and I wish he would sit down with, elder statesmen, even older than me, and he won't see them, he won't sit down with them, you would not be happy with him.
When you say he won't sit down with them, is he purposely not talking to people he should be talking to? And for what reason?
I don't know if he knows it, so I don't know if it's on purpose. They say he's an isolated president, not just on Russia and this. But look, Alan, we are in a warlike situation. Presidents step forward. They do the right thing. They do the wrong thing. But they don't do nothing. I've never seen it in my lifetime. I mean, when we had a crisis with the shoot down with Russia, remember in 1983, Reagan stepped up. Whether he did the right thing or the wrong thing, but he was there. It was his responsibility. The Iranian hostage crisis, Carter didn't want it, but he stepped forward. He was there. He made the decisions. I don't want to go back to World War II or the Korean War, but it just in modern times, if you want the job of being president of the United States, this is part of it. And apart from coming out and making a few unhelpful...
I tell you what, I got a hard break in 10 seconds. Can you hang on for a few minutes on the other side? We'll be back in about 3 or 4 minutes to finish this up.
Sure, we'll never finish it.
Well, I understand that. We'll be back with Professor Stephen Cohen in just... I'm Alan Cohen. We're talking with Dr. Stephen Cohen, Professor of Russian Studies at both NYU and prior to that, Princeton. We are at 877-4-ALAN. And before we get back to the discussion, I know that Ryan wants to jump in with a question for Professor Cohen. Ryan in Seattle, go ahead.
Well, I have a comment real quick, and I'll make it quick, and then I'll listen to his response. I just disagree with his comments that Obama is an indecisive leader. I think he's just quite the opposite. In fact, he has several people around him, which you failed to mention, such as Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is one of his advisors. Who can be more of a statesman than John Kerry? He's done an absolutely wonderful job. Obama has done more on this to try and resolve this than Bush did when Russia invaded Georgia. I mean, what are we going to do? We can't just allow Russia to just go ahead and invade neighboring countries.
All right, do you want to make a speech, or do you have a question?
That's my comment.
Okay. All right, Dr. Cohen, you want to respond?
I don't know if anybody remembers the late Daniel Patrick Moynihan, but he had an adage that we all should live by who comment on public affairs, that each and every one of us is entitled to his or her own opinion. That's democracy. But we are not entitled to our own facts. And part of the reason we're in this crisis that could lead to war with Russia. Look, Alan, you and I talked maybe 2 months ago, 6 weeks ago. You were taken back when I told you this was going to be a new Cold War, and when it could be as bad as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, we're there now. And one of the reasons I was worried is that I was looking at facts, whereas the White House is dealing with opinion. Your caller is entitled to his opinion. If he thinks Obama's been just great, then that's great. Obama doesn't have many supporters left. I have voted for him twice. Lordy, I'm not an Obama basher. I voted for him twice, and I probably even voted for Kerry when he ran for president. I don't remember. It's not true that Zbigniew Brzezinski is an advisor to Obama. So far as I know, they may talk occasionally, but Brzezinski, who's in his late 80s, I think, is not an active member of the Obama administration. The problem is this demonization of Putin, that he invades countries, that he has created this crisis, and all we're doing is trying to react. That's opinion. It's not fact. If you and I had 45 minutes and we wanted to discuss how we got into this, at a minimum, we go back to last November, 2013, when this began, and you would see that Obama, and in fact he's criticized for this in Moscow, he's criticized for this in high political places. He reacts, but he's not pro-reactive. He doesn't initiate. He's been reacting during this crisis all along. He had no intention of annexing Crimea. None whatsoever. How that happened is absolutely clear. It was done in reaction to American policy in Ukraine. Putin thought that NATO was coming for the Russian naval base in Crimea.
So
now,
this could
have been wrong. He may have been wrong. But when you're president of the United States, you don't give people a reason or a perception to act in a way you don't want them to act. Politics, Alan, surely we would agree, is 90% about perception.
So what could President Obama have done to prevent the Crimea annexation?
Let's make it shorter term. In February, to remind everyone, in February, there was a crisis in Kiev. The Ukrainian president, he was popularly elected in a free and fair election, but he was a very bad guy. He was corrupt. But he was the elected president, refused to sign an economic agreement with the European Union. And protesters in Ukraine formed, and there were riots and violence. And Europe, in the form of France and Germany and Poland, there were 3 foreign ministers, brokered a deal with the protesters in the streets and the Ukrainian president, Yanukovych, that he would form a reconciliation government, bring in members of the opposition, everybody would stop throwing Molotov cocktails and shooting at each other, and there would be new presidential and parliamentary elections in December, this year, this coming December. Everybody agreed it looked like a triumph of European democracy, and that night, very bad people in the streets, ultra-nationalist guys, some of them call them Nazis, created a riot, began to march on public buildings. The president, fearful, he was not a brave man, fled to Russia. Now, at that moment, the United States, which had backed all of this, had to make a decision. Do we accept the government that came to power through street riots, a coup, undemocratically? Or do we say, no, you can't do this. You have to live by the agreement you signed. You have to have a coalition government and wait for elections. And the United States made a fatefully unwise decision. They backed this illegitimate government. Putin reacted that by interpreting it to mean that the United States and NATO were now playing a win-win game. They were going to take the whole of Ukraine for NATO. The whole of Ukraine for NATO, including Crimea, including the historic Russian naval base. Now, they may have been wrong. I'm not saying that Putin's perception of what the White House was up to was correct, but that's what he thought. And there was a debate in Moscow, in the Kremlin, about whether they should do that or not. But Putin was told something very simple. Take Crimea today. And by the way, he didn't take Crimea. Crimea historically had been part of Russia. 80% of the people were Russians. They wanted to be part of Russia. It was an accident that they were in Ukraine. They say they reunified with Crimea, but they annexed it. But Putin was told something simple by his intelligence people. Take it today or fight a war there tomorrow, because NATO's coming to Crimea, Russia's only deep water port. So if you were president of Russia and you were presented that kind of political evaluation and intelligence information and had to make that choice, Putin should never have been forced by the White House or Europe to have had to make that choice. That's bad American leadership.
And there's information now.
It's our bad.
Yeah, I understand as you explain it, that probably has not been well explained in the American media.
And that, Alan, just to finish the story, that triggered the war that's going on. It's a civil war in Ukraine now, already historically a deeply divided country, but because everybody in Ukraine, in this profoundly divided country, East and West in the very least, East looking to Russia, the West looking to Europe, now figured everybody wanted everything, and it cut the middle out of the possibility of a negotiation. And that's where we are now. And I mean, we are so close to an actual shooting war with Russia that I think we're inches away from a Cuban Missile Crisis kind of confrontation that was too close to go through again.
You signaled that the last time we spoke, that this could easily happen.
Yeah.
What needs to happen at this moment to stop it from going in that direction?
I will say the only thing I can think to say, I am 1,000% positive that Putin desperately wants a ceasefire and negotiations. Desperately wants it. That he will use whatever influence he has, which is probably 50%, over the fighters in Ukraine, to tell them to go to the negotiating table. The Kiev government will not stop bombing those eastern cities. Only the United States can make them. The White House, Kerry, Obama, the Defense Department.
Why do you think they would listen to the United States?
Kiev, the Ukrainian government?
Yes.
because without American support, that government would be gone tomorrow. By the way, the government resigned today, the parliamentary government. Yes. It quit. It didn't quit because it wanted to quit. Something is going to happen. Another shoe is going to drop, Alan, in the next 48 hours. That's going to help explain why that government quit. But the point is that, and this is a fact, this was testified to at Senate last week by the Defense Department. We, the United States, have advisors, and I quote, embedded in the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. That means we're running that war. They have no money in Kiev. They have no military equipment or expertise other than what was left over from the Soviet Union. We and NATO, Brussels, because this is a kind of Washington NATO bureaucracy in Brussels, joint operation. Without us, that government would fall, and a very, very right-wing government based almost solely in Western Ukraine, which has racial ideas about political solutions, would come to power.
So you don't feel the president is getting the advice he needs to be able to step in the way he needs to and could, because we've got the power to do it.
Again, I don't know enough about what goes on in Washington or the White House or in Obama's mind, but I do know that the political solution to this is probably one of the easiest in the history of world crises.
Yeah.
It is easy. You have to stop the fighting. The rebels, whether we like them or not, we call them pro-Russian separatists. All right, they're not really separatists. They weren't. 80% of them were not separatists 2 months ago. They think they're defending their women and their children by defending their cities. That's what they think. Just like the Palestinians think they're defending their women and children. Just like you and I, if people came to bomb our towns, would try to get a gun and shoot down those planes. We would do that. If they stop attacking us, we will go talk to them. The only people who can stop the attack from Kiev on these cities is the President of the United States. I repeat to you, maybe your listeners don't know this, Germany has asked Kiev to stop. France has asked Kiev to stop. They are the important European countries because the rest of them, forgive me, are headed by clowns at the moment. But Angela Merkel is a very substantial person, the Chancellor of Germany. In fact, to really outrage your listeners, if somebody asked me, are there any statesmen in the world today, people capable of dealing with global problems, I would say yes. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. But we wouldn't put Cameron, the Prime Minister of the UK, in that category, or the President of Poland.
And you wouldn't put Obama in that category?
I do not. I would like to, Alan. I voted for him twice. You think I'm happy?
No.
Are you happy?
No, I'm not.
No,
I'm not.
But
Professor Cohen, I thank you for your time as always, and thank you for the expanded explanation, which I think is important for people to hear. So thank you, sir, for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's nice of you to have me on again.
Appreciate it very much.
Get some unhappy letters.
I'm sure, or emails. Thank you very much.
That's right. I forgot we're in the email.
That's right. We're in the email age. Professor Steve Cohen, Professor of Russian Studies and History Emeritus at NYU. We're coming right back. Phones are open at 877-4-ALAN, 877-367-2526.